because that state of bliss is awe-inspiring, regardless of how we had to get there. But what we want to talk about is the bliss that we can each have at any moment that is not drug-induced or encouraged in any way. And so to understand the thing about bliss is never something you can ever find outwardly. It is not like happiness. It is not like joy. Bliss is an elevated state of consciousness far above happiness. Happiness is something that we often find ourselves seeking outwardly through the perfect garment, through the perfect purchase, through the perfect relationship, through the perfect partner, through the perfect meal, through the perfect house, through the perfect job, the perfect employer, the perfect boss, the perfect co-workers, the perfect whatever. We're looking at everything out here. We just get just right, then we'll be happy. But that's a temporary sense of happiness, because even if all those things got lined up just so for you, it would only be a temporary moment. But bliss is not temporary. Bliss is long-lasting. Bliss is, once you connect with it internally, you cannot share it out here. You can't quite describe it because it's indescribable. But man, once you seek it, you can't wait to get back in and seek more of it. It's kind of like the best buffet you've ever been through. Unlike the ones here in Victoria. This is not a buffet capital, I'll tell you right now. You want the buffet capital? Las Vegas, baby. Las Vegas, that's the buffet capital of North America, as far as I'm concerned. I've heard. So, when I begin to talk about bliss, if it's not a familiar subject with us, a lot of times when we're not familiar with a subject, we immediately want to kind of cut it off and not listen or not open ourselves to it. And that's what I found a lot of times, is that when we're sharing or experiencing something new, something that's foreign, something that we're not knowledgeable about or haven't learned about, we immediately want to have a closed-off mind to it and shut it down, or new ideas. And it happens all the time. It's called the race consciousness, the resistance to change, to new ideas, to new perspectives, to new evolution of consciousness. And I've always often wondered, how can I best describe what often takes place when you're trying to share a new concept or get the mass consciousness to accept a new idea, a new approach. And I come from a family that spent literally the last 3 generations of trying to get people to see things in a different way or see things, a new approach to being in life. As I've shared oftentimes, my grandfather went into organic farming in 1933. And at that time, he was considered really weird. In fact, he died believing that his thoughts of organic farming were really weird and outside of the norm. And then my mother began teaching yoga in 1960 when no one heard of what yoga was. And how frustrated she would be. And I could never quite find the story that would best befit that to explain what that's like. And since I've been sharing about the importance of doing our emotional work because of the effect that our parents have on us in the first 3 years of our life, going back to the moment of conception in our mother's womb, and how dramatic and how important that time is, and when it's not healthy, the effect that it has is life-lasting. And how many times I've shared it and shared it and shared it and shared it and still looked weird. But I thank God for my grandfather that was okay to show me that I was willing to do something, that it's okay to do something that's considered weird. And my mother, she really showed me what it was like to do things weird. But I want to read to you a story that depicts this. True story from Gabramante, The Realm of Hungry Ghosts. I really recommend this book. It's focused on addictions, but just replace addictions, low self-esteem, doesn't matter what it is. Intimacy disorders, whatever it is. I want to read you a story of an example that he had, and it'll really depict this well, and see if this relates to you at all. In his first book was called Scattered Minds. He says, I had laid out some well-established research evidence showing that the mammalian brain develops largely under the influence of the mother's environment, rather than according to strict genetic predetermination. And that this is especially the case with the human brain. These findings were relatively recent, but by then wholly uncontroversial, at least in brain science circles. They were not obscure academic secrets, but had been the subjects of cover articles in both Time and Newsweek. And he was referring to a time in 2000 when his book Scattered Minds was released. He says, I was speaking on the phone with a young producer who had called me from Toronto to discuss a possible studio interview on a national television program. We were going over what material I might present on the air. I was just getting into some of the more fascinating of the research points when she interrupted me. Wait, you mean to tell me that the size of a mother's pupils and how she looks at her baby will affect the chemistry of the kid's brain? I've been preaching that for almost 20 years. You all know that? That if your pupil, the size of your pupil, if it's really dilated, really small, what are you communicating to your child at that time? Anger, stress, upset. It's having an immediate impact in the child's brain. This is well-documented research. How many of our minds right now go, no, that can't be? Not only will it, I said, it does so instantaneously. Dr. Monte responded. I was on a roll, certain that this producer was just as enthralled as I was with the insights of developmental neuroscience. One time, if there's a pattern of, that's ridiculous, she said, interrupting me a second time. There's no way we can use that. And before I could ask her on what grounds she was rejecting the fruits of several decades of scientific investigation, she hung up. That a TV producer, or any layperson for that matter, would have trouble accepting the new brain science is understandable, given the mind-body separation prevalent in our culture. How many of us still believe that what goes on in our mind still has no effect on our body? If you have even the smallest inkling of that, it's important that we open our mind to understand this thing is one unit working together. What goes on up here dramatically and instantaneously affects what's going on down here. It's been so for a long, long, long time. All that's happening is science is proving what New Thought has been teaching and we're way back to Jesus for 2,000 years. That's all that's happening. It's just proving that what we think and what we believe has a dramatic effect and is immediately connected to this body. And the last little part of there. Given the mind-body separation prevalent in our culture, and given, too, how long we've been taught that genes determine almost everything about a human being, personality traits, behavior, eating patterns, and all manner of disease. See, a lot of times we've been taught that disease, such as addictions, are predetermined by our genetic disposition. And I'm going to read you what is the absolute newest revelation that proves that is not so anymore. And it says, brain development in the uterus and during childhood is the single most important biological factor in determining whether or not a person will be predisposed to substance dependence and to addictive behaviors of any sort, whether drug-related or not. Startling as this view may appear to be at first sight, it is amply supported by recent research. Dr. Vincent Felitti was chief investigator in a landmark study of over 17,000 middle-class Americans for Kaiser Permanente and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. Now listen to this part. The basic cause of addiction, and just think of addiction as an unhealthy behavior that you can't stop from doing. So how many of those do we have in our lives currently? Here's what it says. The basic cause of addiction is predominantly experience dependent during childhood and not substance dependent. Experience dependent, that means what is taking place in the environment of our mother's womb for those first 9 months, and then what happens during those first 3 years of the environment that we are immersed in from when we come into this world. Those 3 years determine up to 85 to 90% of our behavior for the rest of our life. Why? Because when we come into this world, our brain is only 18% developed physiologically. Why? If it was any larger, guess what happened? The head's the biggest part of the body coming out of the mother's birth canal. True, women? If it was any larger, for instance, like a horse, whose brain is 90% developed at the time of birth, if our brain is any larger, what? We physiologically couldn't get here. So, in the first 3 years, our brain goes from being 18% developed to 90%. So what is the experience that it is developing, or as Dr. Monte talks about, what is sculpting the brain during that time?